Anyway, thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. It's going to certainly be interesting talking to you. I suppose my first question is threefold, really. I mean, how was the reunion tour? What made you want to do it, and will there be more of it?
Um, well, it was actually really quite quite good. It was quite brilliant.
You guys
Um,
got along okay, yeah?
Everybody got on real well. Everybody wanted to do it. We um, we all had a really good time on stage and playing, and everybody got on, and it was kind of life's too short to carry meaningless grudges and the like. So, yeah, it was. It was genuinely good. All the things that I was afraid could go wrong
Yeah,
or might go wrong, none of them did.
yeah, yeah,
So it was really good because I never ever thought the gigs would happen.
yeah, yeah,
Then the COVID and everything else, and then moving the dates and people's health and stuff like that made it really quite distant.
yeah, yeah,
you know. And even when we were rehearsing, it was still kind of like, well, something can still go horribly wrong even now. So I didn't really believe it was going to happen until, I sort of wandered up there and we actually had to play.
yeah,
And then I was very pleased because the band were really good.
yeah,
We all
yeah,
played great, I thought. And we delivered the songs the way they should have been played. And that was also a great relief. That was
yeah.
something that none of us really knew how that would go until we got in there. But, once you start up, it kind of, some things just fall into place. And I guess when you put the four of us in that room, that it does, it does fall into place. And it did. So I was very glad. It was,
Yeah.
everything was good about it.
Do you think there'll be more?
Everybody was very pleased with what we did, but I can't see it being, doing anything else really, because we've all got other commitments. Dave and Captain have got the new Damned record coming out in the new year. I've got new Sinclair's album coming out in the new year,
Yeah,
and Brian is doing some Lords of the New Church reunion shows and stuff. So yes, it's kind of on. Nobody in the band would say no to doing some more shows, but I just don't think anything's going to happen for at least a year, because
yeah.
everyone's just got other commitments. So
Never say never.
never say never, and
Yeah.
be careful what you wish for.
I'm intrigued to ask you actually your tenure in Masters of the Backside. I mean, did that leave you with a favourable impression of Malcolm McClaren?
Well, I kind of always liked Malcolm
Uh-huh.
because he was a hustler, and I always thought he was sort of reasonably honest with when you spoke to him and you had regular conversations.
Yeah.
He was always, well, with me anyway, he always seemed quite straightforward and ahead. And I think I think he was quite naive about how things worked and stuff. But I always found him very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he put out that he used to say that the Pistols couldn't play, but the music it was irrelevant or something like that. It was all more image as far as he was concerned, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, that was also a very important statement back,
Yeah,
of everybody was, you know, the world seemed, the music world seemed to be made up of just, great musicians that were really technologically and superior in every way to us mere mortals.
and a bit up their own arse, maybe.
Well, they didn't really know what to do with it because I think a lot of those Emerson, Lake and Palmers had taken it as far as they could with their virtuosity and their showing off. And I think that it was a great kind of thing about the music industry and how it keeps things alive and sustains them really through, just being in the shops and advertising and radio play. And, it's kind of, it's a bit like when you buy a pair of shoes, you don't actually buy a pair of shoes that you have in mind or you normally choose, but you make a best choice from what's available.
Yeah.
And I think that was kind of what was going on in '75. So I think it was very difficult and kind of break through didn't to the pub band, that kind of
Yeah.
thinking. So I think it was
Punk was a back to basics thing, then, do you think? A default setting, almost going back to what it should be.
yeah, and just a kind of, you don't really have to practice in your bedroom for 25 years before you can go on stage.
No.
And there were, I think where it was the next generation that really got it for us anyway was because, none of the previous generation, they'd already sort of committed to King Crimson or whatever, or Saturday Night Fever. And I think that the next generation that came along, I think punk was, anyone can do this. You don't need to wear satin jackets. You don't need to be in tune. You don't need to be a great player. But the only real prime requisite was that you had to have an imagination.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that was what punk had in bucket loads. And I think
Yeah.
that punk wasn't really important or so important in 1976. I mean, it was important that it happened, but what really became apparent was a few years later, sort of 10 years later, once people had been allowed to loosen up and do the things that they wanted to do. I think that was when we started to get a more interesting development in the music that people played. I think,
Yeah.
I always cite Green Day as a great example of, sort of who started out, really kind of crappy little punk band and then turned into something, quite unique and quite brilliant, in my own humble opinion. So I think it wasn't just about 1976. It was about what evolved from that.
Yeah. I mean, I read somewhere that Lester Bangs was using the word punk even as early as the very early 70s, writing for Cream magazine when he was describing the Stooges and bands like that. But I also read somewhere that you didn't like the term punk. You didn't like the.
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Well, because I knew what it meant, and it was worthless. Was pretty much, and I didn't think we were worthless. So I never thought it really applied. I think it was just it was another convenient kind of
Lazy term.
Yeah, I think so. And I think they had to label it as something.
Yeah.
And that was, what we ended up with.
I thought Nick Lowe, I thought he does a great job on New Rose. Sniffing Glue described it as has an energy that is quite frightening. But to what extent do you think that record, if at all, was influenced by the New York Dolls' personality crisis?
Not much.
Not much at all. Were the New York Dolls quite an influential band?
No, but you couldn't say that the Dolls weren't an influence because Brian was quite a big fan, and and they had an attitude, and they had some good songs, So it was kind of course, you're going to have an influence from those things. But I'll be honest with you and say that John Coltrane had probably a bigger influence on the Damned attitude to what we did than anything. Brian was the main songwriter, and his love of Sonny Rollins and avant-garde jazz was easily equal to his love of the Stooges and the New York Dolls.
Yeah.
So I think influence is a tough one to nail down.
Yeah.
I think that, yes, of course, there are some things that you approach the same way, maybe with volumes and attitude, but I don't think the Damned ever sat down and said, well, we can just nick that and that'll be all right.
Yeah. Apparently you supported the Flaming Groovies back in the day, and you upstaged them quite significantly. You ended up supporting the Troggs on that tour, if I'm not mistaken. I'm just wondering, was that a match made in heaven?
Well, the Troggs. Well, it wasn't actually a tour. I mean, it was supposed to be, but we only played one show with the Groovies, and then they got sick, and then the next show was at the Roundhouse, I think, in London, and that was with the Troggs and stuff. And Troggs were very punk.
Yeah.
Wild Thing. It was kind of, the English equivalent of Louie Louie.
Yeah. I mean, they had some great tunes. What's that one REM covered? With a Girl Like You, that's them as well, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah. Um, what was it like getting such an endorsement from Led Zeppelin?
um, well, at the time, it was kind of double-edged, really, because on the one hand, you're going, wow, that's Led Zeppelin telling us that they think we're great.
Yeah.
Then on the other hand, every punk rocker in the audience going, Led Zeppelin, who cares what they think? So I remember Mark Perry gave me a particularly hard time at the Roxy because I'd spoken to Robert Plant.
Yeah.
And I thought that was kind of a narrow attitude anyway. It was the fact that they were there and that they liked what we were doing was kind of quite that was a good thing. So and I thought to reject that, if you like, an ally in such a powerful position just out of hand because of who they were was kind of a bit narrow-minded. I think it was, but I think on the other hand, it probably did us a lot of good with Led Zeppelin fans, but I don't know how much. But I don't know. Yeah, no, it was. What can you say about something like that? Yeah.
So I'm reminded of quite an interesting story. Can played a gig in some German nightclub, and David Niven, the actor, was in the audience, and they approached him afterwards and said, "What did you think of our music?" He said, "Oh, I thought it was wonderful, but I didn't realize it was music." But going back to Led Zeppelin, I mean, John Bonham as a drummer, I mean, how do you rate John Bonham and people like Keith Moon? Obviously, they came slightly before you. What was your impression of them?
Well, I I was a drum fanatic, so anything that had a lot of drums on it was all right by me. That was all. I wouldn't have even joined a band if I didn't have to. If I could have just gone out and played a drum kit on my own without the other three, I'd have happily done it. But life doesn't work like that. So I was always really keen on anything that was a lot of drums, and obviously, that kind of Moon was the the main guy. Him and Ginger Baker were my two kind of favourites, along with also Dave Clark and Sandy Nelson and Gene Krupa. So it's anything that had a lot of that bashing going on was all right by me.
Yeah, well, Ginger Baker was originally a jazz drummer, wasn't he?
As was Bonham.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Lou Edmonds said Rat Scabies is a jazz drummer, but with a Keith Moon attitude. Would you say
Really?
he's right?
I keep getting accused of being a jazz drummer these days. I'm fucking not.
Yeah.
But
But you're wearing sandals under there, aren't you?
well, yeah. Thank God I'm sitting, cameras on your waist high. But I think there's a few things about jazz that are really valid. One is the generally speaking, the freedom, the musical freedom that you have, which is where me and Brian always got on, was because we could both feed off what the other bloke did. And the other thing with jazz is that it has a great feel and a great swing. And I learned that there was a huge difference between playing a song and then playing it right.
Yeah.
And if you play it right, everybody loves you. If you play it wrong, you're just boring, But I remember when I was a kid, I was in the Sea Cadets.
Okay.
All things, and we had this amazing band leader. And he used to get all the band would all be in their uniforms and everything, marching up and down and doing the poppy days and all of that stuff. And then on the way home, he'd always, as you were marching back, he'd always get the band to play St. Louis Blues March, which if you've stood in the middle of 20 snare drums and a live, big, big brass section and everything else. But what made him such a great band leader was when we were doing the marching up and down stuff, it sounded, just like that. But when it got to St. Louis Blues March, the whole thing would swing, and it'd suddenly have a different kind of, you'd march with a bounce.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Mills was the other person that had that in bundles of all people. When I worked at the Fairfield Halls, she was on the Mike and Bernie Winters shows. But every night she'd go on stage and just this old lady and a piano, and she'd have pretty much the audience on its feet. She knew how to deliver. She knew how to play it. And I don't know if it's a conscious thing or not, but she got it right. And so I realised with both of those sorts of people that it really was about how you do it. And if you've got a bit of passion and commitment, it doesn't matter if you make, if you hit some wrong notes, it doesn't matter if you drift out slightly or whatever. But if your attitude's right and you're playing it as if you care, then people pick up on that.
It's about engagement with the audience.
Yeah, which isn't an easy thing to do. As we know, it's a sum total of parts. And every person in front of you in that audience is in a different mood in some ways, and they've had a different journey there, and a different argument with their girlfriend, or been overcharged for a beer, or just got piss on their leg or something. You know what I mean? It's like every one of them's different. So when it comes together as a collective, it's kind of a weird thing, because you can't individually play to them. You can only play to an audience as a whole. And that's kind of it's one of the strange things about humanity, is the way that it does draw itself together when music and rhythm start around them.
But isn't that connection lost when you get these bands playing these huge stadiums like the Stones? I mean, isn't that connection with the audience kind of lost in a way?
Well, I've never done enough of those big shows to know. But it's definitely much harder to communicate with an audience. There's something about when you can see the whites of their eyes, it's kind of quite easy to wave and smile, But when that's sort of taken away and they're 100 yards away, then that's not as... It's harder to get through to them, I think. Well, it has to travel further, I guess.
That's why all the show becomes all these pyrotechnics and things like that, I guess, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I think so.
How did Eddie and the Hot Rods end up on the reverse of the first Damned album?
That was because I think Jake Riviera figured out that if there were 2,000 misprints, that would be enough to cover the cost of making the record.
Oh, okay.
So he made the first 2,000 as a collector's item, knowing that all the collectors would buy one.
Right.
And then...
Did it work?
I guess so. I mean...
How much do they go on eBay now, those albums?
I don't know. I mean, I really don't. The last one I heard of went for about 2,000.
Well, that's a fair bit. Pay my heating bill anyway.
Yeah.
For a week, maybe.
Oh, how I wish I'd kept more of them.
I read somewhere that Cliff Richard refused to introduce you when you did the TV program Supersonic. Did that give you the ump at all?
No. I mean,
what was it about? Is it the name he objected
to? I really don't know. I wasn't privy to any of the conversations as to the whys and why nots. I just don't, I mean, let's go on, it's Cliff Richard. How can you introduce a band called The Dams that were kind of, part of the punk rock thing, which was the biggest sort of rebellion that this country had for musical rebellion for, 10 years or something. So
I thought you would have kind of liked that kind of back to rock and roll type vibe that punk had in some respects.
Well, you'd think, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But if I don't know if you could really count Sir Cliff as being rock and roll.
I was just going to say, Cliff Richard apparently didn't like performing the song Devil Woman So it fits into what we were saying, I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how you can make a record called Devil Woman #1 with it, and
Yeah.
then I don't like singing this. It's in league with Satan.
T-Rex, I mean, supporting them, that must have been quite a big deal.
Yeah, it was. It was good. It put us in with a whole different audience,
Uh-huh.
and the band that Mark had were really great. Anyway, it was Herbie Flowers, and Tony Newman, and they were of course great fun, and just just hanging out with grown-ups,
Yeah.
if you like. And Mark was, always really cool. Never a crossword or anything. Even when our audience gobbed all over their gear, and
Yeah.
he didn't complain about it. He just told them to get plastic sheets and cover the gear up while we were on stage. Which not many people would have done.
Yeah. 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 Talking about being grown up, I've got to ask you, is it true that was it you or Captain Sensible that set fire to Elvis Costello's shoes?
Mm. Oh, it was the captain, I think.
Well, is it true you had a bit of a bust up with Joan Jett?
No, not really. Well, the thing is, there are people, journalists and the like in the world that were desperate for stories
Yeah.
and invented quite a few things just to do exactly that.
Yeah. So that's a
So,
load more cobblers, is it?
well, she used to send me Runaways albums and stuff like that and things. We were quite matey, but it wasn't a big deal. It was only other
Yeah.
people that tried to turn it into something else, and then but that's not really something I ever sort of dwell on or think about. To be honest, it was just someone that you knew.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that the Jam, the Stranglers, and the Damned all released two albums in 1 year, 77, I think it was. Was a healthy rivalry between you and those other bands?
No, I didn't ever think so. In fact, I used to hang out with both of those bands quite often. They were, I like what they did, and the thing that a lot of people forget is that if you like, the first wave of punk bands were all very, very different, and none
Yeah.
of them sounded the same. It was, Damn didn't sound like the Clash didn't sound like the Pistols didn't sound like the Jam didn't sound like the Stranglers, Eddie and the Hot Rods didn't sound like any of them. And, the Ramones didn't sound like anyone. Patti Smith was totally unique. And it there wasn't a punk rock formula. It
Yeah.
was about imagination and what you did with it. That was the important thing.
Yeah. Um, I've got to ask you because all my followers on my channel are big prog rock fans, really, and I've got to ask you about Nick Mason as a producer. I mean, how did you find him as a producer, and has it
Was it
turned you into
prog
a big
rock?
Pink Floyd fan? Yeah.
I wouldn't have said it was prog rock, but um, he, I always got on really well with Nick.
Yeah.
He was, yeah. I used to kind of, I used to like what he did live at Pompeii. Is one of the greatest sort of, for me anyway, was probably his finest hour for me because it was a guy in a drum kit playing his heart out. That was the thing, and I think the record company and Men in Suits thought just having that Pink Floyd connection would do us a lot of good in America, and again would help sales somehow. And I think Brian and Captain and Dave were probably wanted to make a more psychedelic record than it was, whereas I think Nick took the approach of that punk rock was really all about honesty, and
Yeah.
I think that was how he recorded it, was so you could hear what we'd done, and I think he tried to catch the best performances while we did it. And I think I think he did okay. I think
Yeah.
it wasn't particularly spectacular,
Hmm.
but and it wasn't up to him to make it spectacular. It was up to the band to do that.
I suppose. Are you overall? Do you think the sound is very different from the first Damned album? Do you think? Uh,
Yeah, of course.
uh,
I mean, there was a microphone on each drum when you went in with Pink Floyd,
yeah,
as opposed to just the three when we worked with Nick.
yeah, yeah,
And yeah, it was a big difference. Of course, it was had a lot more clarity to it
yeah,
and a lot less scrub. There's something about when you work on 8 tracks, like tape recordings in the old days, you kind of have to get it right in 3 minutes. And you can't really stop and drop in or change anything or repair things later on. But when you're working in, Britannia Rowan, it's 24 track and there's room to maneuver and do things. I think you just end up with
yeah.
a, a very different sound.
This must have been just after Floyd had done their Animals album. I tell you, it must have been about 78, was it?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
77, 78.
yeah. What happened to the White Cats? And didn't you do a Peel session?
We did do a Peel session, yeah. But White Cats was something that I put together because I was writing quite a lot of songs at the time. And I thought that, there's not much point in writing them if nobody ever hears them. So maybe I should put a band together and do all of that kind of thing. But really, it was something I was never that comfortable with, being in charge, if you like. I didn't really like that. I would say the pressure of, but having to sort of constantly come up with songs and keep everything in line, and then talk to the managers who tell you why there wasn't any money, and then doing all of that thing. And there wasn't the same camaraderie in the band that I'd had with the Damned, so it was a bit. And in the end, I just started to talking to Captain because we'd never really been out of touch through all of that time. And we just both weren't really that happy with the situation we were in, with our own band. So we decided that we'd get together and see what we could come up with.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, John Peel was a big champion of the whole punk and new wave scene. I'm just saying, how was it like working with John Peel?
Uh, well, you didn't get to see him very often. He, we bump into him around places, and it's very difficult, because you say, all right, John, do you want a pint? And you sort of buy him a beer, and then you'd be sort of like, well, I do want to tell you how grateful I am for all the exposure you've given us, and thanks for all the loyalty and playing the records. But actually, that's not really what you should say. The conversation with John Peel would never have been about your career or what was going on. You could maybe talk about other bands, but actually, a conversation about football would get you a lot further within buying the next round.
Yeah. Um, I was going to ask you. I mean, the Black Album. I mean, would you consider the Black Album to be a kind of a psychedelic album at all? A lot of it. And was it true that the working? This might be wrong, but what's the working title of that record? Atom Heart Mugger.
I've never heard that before. I don't think it was, but because the the whole thing about it was the track Curtain Call, which came as a surprise to all of us because we weren't expecting to record it. We didn't even know it existed until we got to the studio and Dave pulled out the lyrics, and then we sort of looked at the lyrics and went, well, what else have you got? And he said, well, I've got these ideas. So then him and Captain sort of sat up piecing these ideas that Dave had together, and the different sections and where it would work out. And then, of course, we had Hans Zimmer along as well on that one. So he did the synths and did the production and stuff. So it was it wasn't meant to be prog rock, and it wasn't even meant to be on the record. But once we'd recorded it, we realised that it was. I'd say rather than prog rock, I'd rather say it was a very progressive piece of music.
Yeah.
You know, because I always think of prog rock as squiddly boink ding dong. You know, kind of the moon over Amsterdam. You know, and all that kind of
Yeah.
calm space shanty and Gentle Giant and bands like that. Which it was nothing like that, but it was a progression of moods and if you like musical environments, man. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was like a kind of journey, and that's why it ended up being a double album, was because we suddenly found ourselves with a three-sided record.
Yeah, I mean that's so that it became so the last side ended up being live. Yeah, that's right. Is that
Yeah,
why you just fill it out?
that was why we didn't have anything else to put on it, and so we
Yeah,
just thought, well, let's do a, we may as well go live for something.
yeah. Yeah. With that music though, I'm just wondering, were you listening to or harkening back a little bit to the sound of some bands like the 13th Floor Elevators or the Electric Prunes? Were they, that psychedelia? Did that interest you at all, especially American psychedelia?
Well, not me so much, but Dave and the Captain were very big on the Pebbles and Nuggets albums and stuff,
Okay.
so and the 13th Floor Elevators and the thing. So there was a lot of that kind of on in the background while we were around, but also, a lot of film score. Ennio Morricone, and Dave was a big movie fan, and he'd find, the bits where there's great stuff happening musically, and he'd say, "Listen, this is the sort of thing I'm talking about." This kind, so like I say, Brian. Well, not Brian because he wasn't around then, but my thing was always I liked pop, but I also kind of got some of the other stuff as well.
Yeah,
Some
yeah,
of the good stuff. I don't know. Um, it's like good and bad, isn't it? If you
mhm.
like Court of the Crimson King, I've never played more than 21st Century Schizoid Man because, in its own right, that is a work of genius. But I couldn't tell you what track 2 was,
Yeah, yeah,
because that kind of did enough.
yeah, yeah. I mean, talking about pop,
Caravan I used to like, and Family, if they count,
family.
and Caravan, yeah.
Yeah, well, Caravan all part of that Canterbury scene, very English
Yeah.
scene.
But
Talking about
period-
pop, sorry, go on.
no, just because Caravan always used to play in odd timings and things, but it never sounded like they did.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
he was one of my favourite drummers, John Coughlin, because for that very reason, that he used to be able to play in 7 and make it groove. It's not easy. And Family again were, you know, people call them prog rock, but they're not, or they weren't. I don't think. I think they were just a band. They were
yeah.
quite unique in their own way. And I'll plug it now. Interestingly, we got Roger Chapman to sing a track on the new Sinclair's album
Oh wow.
which I'm very pleased about because it's like a lifelong ambition. I've always been a big fan of his.
Is he in still good? He's still got great voice.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. His voice is still Roger Chapman.
yeah.
There's
So
no
when is this Sinclair's album? When will we see that?
Um, I've been told early summer is our current release date, but I don't know when that actually is. But it's going to be called "The Long Slow Death of a Cigarette."
Is there a pre-order link?
I don't think so yet. It's on Cleopatra Records though.
If there was, I'd certainly stick it below this video. Is it feel very different working with the Sinclairs as opposed to say, a band like the Damned?
Well, there's only 2 of us in the Sinclairs, which makes it
Easier.
much easier, much harder to dictate to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's. I like to think it's the best elements of the Damned, which is the songs are really good and great. I think they're great songs, and they're very coherent and it's all melody led,
Yeah,
which I think always pays off. But also at the same time, there's quite a lot of experimental things that happen
yeah,
and things that you wouldn't normally do on a conventional song that seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah,
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 and you
yeah,
try stuff out, and that was one of the great things about the Damned was the freedom that we always had. That, and if anybody had any kind of an idea for a track, then it was always, it was always welcomed. Not always used, but it was always welcomed.
yeah,
Just as.
yeah, yeah. I mean, we talked about mentioning pop music. I'm just curious, how much did Captain Sensible's solo career, how much of that was a distraction from the Damn Strawberries album?
Um, Not that much, really. I think I think a bit later on, it got harder
Yeah,
to make the two careers work. But it was. But I think on the Strawberries album, the Captain never came up short with anything because he'd been happy talking. It was kind of, you know, what he put into that album is what he put into every record. He did his best to make it all sound as good as was humanly possible.
yeah. Um, Melody Maker describes Phantasmagoria as your master work. Do you think they're correct?
Uh, I think it's bloody good,
Mhm.
but here's the thing with the Damned was it went through different stages of itself. You had the Brian James years, which was kind of punk rock, and then with Machine Gun Etiquette and Strawberries, it became much more. I suppose you'd have called it Britpop or indie
Mm.
pop at the time. And then with Phantasmagoria, it went into kind of a commercial pop phase,
Mhm.
which I think all three stages were very valid in their own right. But it really depends when you started listening to the band as to which one was your favourite, or which one was particularly your biggest influence. I think Phantasmagoria and Machine Gun Etiquette and Damn 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 really, they kind of they're the flagships for that era of the band, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I've one more question for you, and that is, which album would you consider to be culturally, in terms of music and rock and roll, more important, the Elvis debut or Sergeant Pepper?
I think I'd have to say Elvis, really, because without that happening,
There wouldn't have been, the
um,
Beatles are all influenced by that, weren't they?
yeah. So I think you'd have to go with that as ground one. It
Yeah,
all starts here.
yeah. I mean, it's a great album. Those Sun recordings that he did are just fantastic. I think he kind of lost it a little bit going
But
into movies.
when you watch the old film of him from as far back as you can go, if he turned up today doing that act, he'd be a hit.
Yeah,
Because he was just really good at it.
yeah.
And, you know,
I mean, that
uh,
label, that label you had, what was on Sun Records? You had Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis. What a roll call that was.
yeah, you just kind of wonder whether it was because some were the most sympathetic to that kind of artist.
Yeah, yeah, I guess.
Whereas none of the, again, as usual, none of the majors were really interested in Elvis. Why would they?
Yeah,
They had no idea until they kind of people showed them how many records they could sell and how many people would go and see him perform. Why would they bother? They had, Pat Boone or someone else or, whatever.
That's an interesting quote I always reel out when we talk about Elvis. Is James Brown said Elvis Presley was just a hillbilly that discovered the blues. But he's more than that, of course. But it was a funny quote, I think.
I thought I thought Elvis got a lot of his from the gospel churches.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, when you listen to some of those recordings, that's real, and almost certainly where James Brown got a lot of his from as well
Oh,
was
James Brown was using a lot of that call and response you got in gospel music when he went all funk from '66 onwards. It's
yeah,
uh,
for sure.
It's great stuff. It's great stuff. Anyway, I can't thank you enough for agreeing to do this interview. I wish you the best of luck with that Sinclair's album. If there is a pre-ordering link, I'll be happy to put it under this video. And
Yeah,
enjoy the rest of your day.
well, indeed. Well, you have a good day as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, mate. Cheers.
Cheers, bye.